The digital clock at Millbrook Mall showed 11:47 p.m. when Marcus Stone made his 10th round of the night. His footsteps echoed through the empty main corridor, a rhythmic and constant sound that had become the soundtrack of the early hours. The security lights created yellowish circles on the marble floor, and Marcus walked from one to another as if following an invisible map etched in his mind. At 75, Marcus was a familiar but ignored figure at the mall. During the day, employees and customers passed by him as if he were part of the furniture, his grey hair always combed with cheap gel, his navy blue uniform impeccably clean but visibly mended, and that particular way of speaking, long pauses between words, as if each syllable needed to be carefully considered before escaping. "Good evening, Mr. Marcus." The artificial voice of the internal sound system greeted him automatically every half hour, a forgotten programming from some previous manager that no one had bothered to change. Marcus stopped in front of the GameStop window, watching the reflections of emergency lights on the dark glass. For a moment, his face reflected back at him, deep wrinkles, a small, irregular scar on his right temple that most people assumed was from some domestic accident, and brown eyes that seemed to carry decades of weariness. "Always talking to yourself, old Marcus?" The young, mocking voice echoed through the corridor. Marcus turned slowly, unhurried, and saw Dylan Rodriguez approaching. Dylan was one of the food court employees, 19 years old, green-dyed hair and a tribal tattoo climbing up his neck. He worked the night shift cleaning tables and closing restaurants, but always found time to provoke Marcus. "Wasn't talking to myself," Marcus replied, his voice carrying that peculiar cadence that made some people look at him with pity and others with irritation. "Sure you weren't," Dylan laughed, pulling his phone from his pocket. "Hey guys, check this out." He started recording. "It's Marcus, our most, how should I put it, special security guard." Marcus watched the young man film for a few seconds, then simply resumed his walk. He knew Dylan would post the video on some social network, that it would receive cruel laughs and comments, and that the next morning more employees would look at him with that mix of amusement and embarrassment. It wasn't news. "Come on, Marcus, won't you say something funny for my followers?" But Marcus had already turned the corner, heading toward the mall's east wing. His keys jingled softly on his belt, a metallic symphony that had accompanied him for almost 12 years in that job. The security room was hidden in the back of the mall, between the Sears storage room and the electrical transformer room. It was a claustrophobic space, with 2 rows of monitors showing black and white images of all corridors, stores, and entrances. Marcus knew every blind spot, every defective pixel, every camera that needed manual adjustment when strong wind shook the external cables. He sat in the worn swivel chair and checked the monitors methodically, one by one. North entrance, clear. South entrance, clear. Food court, Dylan still wandering with phone in hand. Department store, emergency lights blinking in normal sequence. Marcus grabbed his thermos and poured black coffee into an enamel mug with the phrase, "World's Greatest Grandpa," a gift he'd found abandoned in Lost and found 5 years earlier. He had no grandchildren. He had no children. In fact, he had no one waiting for him beyond the silent walls of his small apartment 20 minutes away. The security radio crackled. "Marcus, you there?" The voice belonged to Janet Hendricks, supervisor of the night cleaning crew. Janet was one of the few people at the mall who treated Marcus with something resembling respect, though even she spoke to him in that slightly louder, slower tone people used with children or the elderly. "Yes, Janet, I'm here. Could you check the toy store? Samantha thinks she left the back door unlocked." "On my way." Marcus stood up, adjusted his leather belt with its collection of keys, radio, and flashlight, and headed toward Kiddie Kingdom. The toy store was located in the mall's family section, surrounded by a children's clothing store, a candy shop, and a small arcade that had been closed for maintenance for 3 months. As he walked, Marcus's mind drifted to the morning routine he'd perfected over the years. He'd arrive home at 7 a.m., make instant oatmeal, watch the morning news while eating, then sleep until 4 p.m. He'd wake up, shower, put on his uniform, drive to the mall, and start another night shift. 12 years of the same routine, broken only by his 2 weeks of vacation each summer, which he spent reading military history books in his apartment. The toy store's neon sign buzzed slightly as Marcus approached. Kiddie Kingdom, in bright rainbow letters, with a cartoon castle and smiling cartoon characters that looked cheerful during the day, but somehow unsettling in the dim emergency lighting. Marcus pulled out his master key ring, a collection of nearly 40 keys of various sizes and shapes. He knew each one by touch, could identify them in complete darkness. The front door was secure. Marcus walked around the store's perimeter, checking the side access that led to the storage area. As he turned the corner into the service corridor, he heard something that made him stop immediately. Voices, low, urgent voices coming from inside the store. Marcus felt something cold spread through his chest, not fear exactly, but a familiar sensation he hadn't felt in decades. His breathing became more controlled, his movements more deliberate. Without thinking, he crouched slightly and approached the back door of Kiddie Kingdom. The door was indeed unlocked, slightly ajar. Through the gap, Marcus could see the glow of flashlights moving inside the store. 3 minutes behind schedule, a male voice was saying. Rodriguez said the old man wouldn't be around this section until midnight. Marcus recognized the name. Dylan, the kid who'd been filming him an hour ago. Doesn't matter, another voice responded, this one with a slight accent Marcus couldn't immediately place. We stick to the plan. Cameras go down at exactly midnight, then we move to the main target. What if someone sees us? No one will see us. And if they do, there was a metallic sound like someone checking a weapon. Well, we came prepared for that too. Marcus felt his pulse slow down rather than speed up, a physiological response that would have puzzled any doctor. His mind became crystalline, each sound and shadow gaining sharp definition. He estimated 3, maybe 4 people inside the store. They were using it as a staging area for something bigger. He slowly backed away from the door, moving with a silence that seemed impossible for a 75-year-old man who supposedly suffered from coordination problems. When he was safely around the corner, Marcus reached for his radio. But as his finger touched the call button, he heard the sound that changed everything. Children's voices, frightened children's voices. Please, we just want to go home. Shut up. All of you, stay quiet. Marcus's blood went ice cold. This wasn't just a robbery. They had hostages. 7 distinct voices, 7 children. Marcus Stone stood in the service corridor of Millbrook Mall at 11:58 p.m. on what should have been another routine night, listening to the sound of frightened children, and felt something awaken inside him that had been dormant for 60 years. The same something that had once carried 7 wounded soldiers across a minefield in Normandy while Nazi bullets whistled overhead. But tonight, in a toy store in suburban America, Marcus Stone was no longer just a slow-talking security guard that everyone ignored. Tonight, Marcus Stone was going to war. The clock struck midnight, and every security camera in Millbrook Mall went dark. Marcus Stone had exactly 90 seconds before someone would notice the security cameras were down. In his 12 years at Millbrook Mall, he'd memorized every protocol, every response time, every weak point in the system. The monitoring company would attempt 3 automatic resets before dispatching a technician, giving him maybe 20 minutes of total darkness before outside help arrived. 20 minutes to save 7 children from armed criminals who had inside information about his patrol routes. Marcus moved through the service corridors with a fluidity that would have shocked anyone who'd seen him struggle to pour coffee an hour earlier. His feet found the quiet spots on the floor automatically, avoiding the loose tile near the Brookstone entrance and the squeaky section by the old radio shack. These weren't skills he'd learned as a security guard. These were skills he'd learned in occupied France, 78 years ago. The building's blueprints unfolded in his mind like a tactical map. Kiddie Kingdom had 3 entrances: main storefront, service door where the hostiles had entered, and an emergency exit that connected to the service tunnel running behind Spencer's. The emergency exit would be locked from the inside, but Marcus knew something the criminals didn't. Every lock in Millbrook Mall was connected to the same master override system, and Marcus Stone was one of only 2 people who knew the bypass code. He reached the security office and slipped inside without turning on the lights. The radio was crackling with automated messages, the camera system attempting to reboot, the monitoring company's computers trying to establish contact. Marcus ignored it all and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside, beneath a stack of incident reports and employee manuals, was a worn leather folder he hadn't opened in 5 years. His hands trembled slightly, not from age but from the weight of memory, as he pulled out a single black-and-white photograph. 7 young men in army uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. The photo was dated June 3rd, 1944, 3 days before D-Day. Marcus's face was barely recognizable, smooth, confident, with the cocky smile of a 20-year-old who thought he was invincible. Sergeant Matthew "Ghost" Stone, 101st Airborne Division. The youngest squad leader in the company, and according to his commanding officer, either the bravest or most insane paratrooper in the European theatre. Marcus touched the scar on his temple, feeling the small depression where shrapnel had nearly killed him on Omaha Beach. The doctor said he was lucky to be alive. They never said he was lucky to have his speech slowed, his coordination affected, his mind sometimes fuzzy around the edges. But tonight, with 7 children's lives hanging in the balance, Marcus Stone wasn't feeling lucky. He was feeling lethal. The service tunnel behind Spencer's was narrow and filled with pipes, electrical conduits, and the constant hum of ventilation systems. Marcus crawled through it with practiced silence, his security uniform now streaked with dust and grease. The confined space triggered memories of German bunkers, of crawling through rubble while machine guns chattered overhead. But he pushed them down. The past was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. He reached the junction that led to Kiddie Kingdom's emergency exit and paused to listen. The voices were clearer now, filtering through the thin wall that separated the service area from the store's stockroom. "Status report?" A new voice, authoritative and cold. The leader. "Perimeter secure." Mall security is clueless, just one old man making his rounds. Marcus's jaw tightened. Dylan Rodriguez's voice. "Cameras." "Down as scheduled. We have a clean 20-minute window before anyone gets suspicious." "And the packages?" "Ready to move. 7 units, ages 6 to 12, all secured in the play area." "Units." They were calling the children units. "Transport?" "Waiting at loading dock 3. Route is clear, just like Rodriguez promised." Marcus closed his eyes, processing the information. This wasn't a robbery or random crime. This was human trafficking, carefully planned with inside help. The children weren't random victims. They'd been specifically targeted and gathered. 7 children. Just like his squad in Normandy. Marcus pulled out his phone and tried to call 911, but the signal was dead. The criminals had used a jamming device. He was completely on his own, just like that day on the beach when German mortars had cut his unit off from Allied lines. The difference was, this time he wasn't 20 years old and immortal. This time, he was a 75-year-old man with damaged nerves and slowed reflexes, facing trained criminals with modern weapons. This time, he had everything to lose. Marcus reached the emergency exit and carefully input the override code. The lock disengaged with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. He waited, counting heartbeats, but no alarm sounded. The door opened into Kiddie Kingdom's stockroom, a cramped space filled with cardboard boxes and plastic bins. Through the stockroom's doorway, he could see into the main store. The children were sitting in a circle in the play area, hands zip-tied behind their backs, eyes wide with terror. 7 little faces, the youngest couldn't be more than 6, a small girl with pigtails who kept trying not to cry. 3 armed men moved around the store with military precision, not gang members or common criminals. These were professionals, ex-military, possibly mercenaries. Marcus recognized the way they held their weapons, the systematic way they checked sight lines and escape routes. The leader was a tall man with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore expensive tactical gear and carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. When he spoke, it was in the clipped tones of career military. "Rodriguez, you're certain about the security guard's pattern?" Dylan nodded eagerly, clearly out of his depth among these professionals. "Yeah, absolutely. Marcus is, well, he's not all there, you know. Talks real slow, moves even slower. He won't be back to this section for another hour." "And if he does come back early?" Dylan shrugged. "He's just an old man. What's he gonna do?" The leader studied Dylan for a moment with the kind of look Marcus recognized from his own commanding officers, the look of someone evaluating whether a subordinate was useful or expendable. "Clean this up," the leader said finally, gesturing towards some equipment scattered on the floor. "We move the packages in 10 minutes." Marcus had heard enough. He retreated back through the emergency exit, his mind already formulating a plan. 3 armed professionals, 1 nervous amateur, 7 hostages. The odds were impossible by any reasonable measure, but Marcus Stone had never been reasonable. In the service tunnel, he opened his security belt and began modifying his equipment. The heavy-duty flashlight could be used as a weapon. His key ring with 40 metal keys made an effective improvised flail. The radio could serve as a distraction device. Most importantly, he had something the criminals didn't expect: the knowledge that he was already dead. He died on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, when Nazi shrapnel had torn through his skull and stolen his easy words, his quick movements, his simple faith in tomorrow. Everything since then had been borrowed time. Marcus Stone had been living as a ghost for 78 years. Tonight, it was time to remember how to haunt. The first part of his plan was psychological warfare. Marcus knew these criminals had studied him, watched him, dismissed him as a threat. Their greatest weakness was their certainty about who he was. He began in the toy section, where mechanical robots and electronic games were displayed on high shelves. Using his master keys, Marcus activated every noise-making toy he could find. Robot voices began chattering, cars started beeping, music boxes played discordant melodies. The cacophony filled the store with chaotic sound. "What the hell?" one of the guards started to say. "Electrical malfunction," the leader snapped. "Richardson, check the breaker box." Marcus was already moving, using the noise as cover to reach the action figure aisle. He began a systematic campaign of misdirection, a toy here, a sound there, creating the impression of malfunctioning equipment while he gathered intelligence on his enemy's positions and weaknesses. The leader was smart, though. After the 3rd malfunction, he held up a hand for silence. "Richardson, Torres, secure the perimeter. Someone's playing games with us." Marcus froze behind a display of stuffed animals, watching as the 2 subordinates spread out to search the store. These weren't panicked amateurs. They moved with tactical precision, covering each other's blind spots, communicating with hand signals. But Marcus had one advantage they couldn't have anticipated. He knew every inch of Kiddie Kingdom better than his own apartment. He'd walked past this store twice a night for 12 years, had helped with 3 different renovations, had even assisted during the Christmas rush when they needed extra security. He knew that the mirror in the dress-up section was 2-way glass, leading to a storage closet. He knew that the train table in the center of the store had a hidden compartment where employees stored valuable items during busy periods. Most importantly, he knew that the castle playhouse in the corner had a secret passage connecting to the adjacent candy store's storage area. Marcus began to move through the store like smoke, appearing and disappearing, always one step ahead of the searching guards. A toy would activate behind them, drawing their attention, while Marcus slipped past in their peripheral vision. To the children watching from the play area, he was a shadow among shadows, a ghost in a security uniform. But the leader was getting suspicious. "This isn't equipment failure," he said quietly into his radio. "Someone's in here with us." "The old guard?" Richardson's voice crackled back. "Impossible. Rodriguez assured us he was—" The lights went out. Marcus had found the main electrical panel and thrown the master switch, plunging Kiddie Kingdom into complete darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in 3 seconds later, but those 3 seconds of total blackness were enough. When the dim red glow illuminated the store, Marcus Stone was standing 15 feet away from the leader, holding a toy lightsaber that cast eerie shadows on the walls. "Evening." "Gentlemen," Marcus said, his slow, deliberate speech suddenly sounding less like a disability and more like a death sentence. "I think we need to talk." The leader raised his weapon, but Marcus was already moving, diving behind the castle playhouse as gunfire erupted through the store. The children screamed, but Marcus noted with professional satisfaction that the leader was shouting at his men to watch their backgrounds. They were professionals enough not to risk hitting the hostages. That gave Marcus exactly the advantage he needed, as bullets shredded stuffed animals and shattered plastic toys around him. Marcus Stone smiled for the first time in 12 years. The ghost of Normandy was back in business. And somewhere in the chaos of gunfire and children's screams, Dylan Rodriguez was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, he'd made a terrible mistake about the slow-talking old man who cleaned up after everyone else's messes. Because Marcus Stone had been cleaning up messes for 78 years, and he was very, very good at it. Marcus Stone had been shot at by experts before. The Nazi machine gunner in the church tower at Sainte-Mère-Église had been an expert. The SS sniper in the ruins of Carentan had been an expert. The mortar crew that had nearly killed him on Omaha Beach, they'd been experts too. These men shooting at him in a toy store were good, but they weren't experts. Marcus could tell by the way they conserved ammunition, the careful 3-round bursts, the disciplined communication between shots. Professional mercenaries, probably former special forces, but they lacked the desperate precision of men who'd learned to kill in a war where every bullet might be their last. That was their weakness. Marcus had learned to fight when bullets were precious and death was cheap. He rolled from behind the castle playhouse to the train table, using the elaborate wooden railway set as cover. The leader, Marcus had mentally designated him Alpha, was coordinating a systematic sweep of the store. Richardson and Torres moved with military precision, but they were thinking like soldiers clearing a building, not like someone hunting a ghost. "Target is mobile, elderly male, possibly armed," Alpha spoke into his throat mic. "Rodriguez, what weapons does mall security carry?" Dylan's voice crackled back from somewhere near the front of the store. Just a flashlight and radio, maybe pepper spray. I don't know, he never seemed dangerous." "Well, he seems dangerous now," Torres muttered, reloading behind a display of board games. Marcus smiled grimly. If they thought he seemed dangerous now, they had no idea what dangerous really looked like. He'd learned dangerous from Technical Sergeant William Wild Bill Morrison, who could kill a man with a playing card. He'd learned dangerous from Lieutenant Colonel James Jimmy the Knife Patterson, who'd taken out an entire German patrol with nothing but an entrenching tool and pure spite. He'd learned dangerous from the best killers the U.S. Army had ever produced. But most of all, he'd learned dangerous from 7 dying men in a crater outside Sainte-Mère-Église, who'd begged him to save their lives while Nazi bullets turned the air around them into a symphony of death. Marcus reached into his belt and pulled out something he'd carried for 12 years but never thought he'd use. A small utility knife barely 3 inches long that he used to open packages and cut zip ties during his security rounds. In the right hands, 3 inches was more than enough. Ghost 6 to command. We are compromised. Repeat, we are compromised. Alpha's voice had changed, becoming clipped and urgent. He was speaking to someone outside the mall, someone with authority over the operation. Marcus strained to hear the response through Alpha's earpiece, but caught only fragments. Abort protocol. Sanitize witnesses. Extraction in 15. Sanitize witnesses. Military euphemism for murder. They weren't just planning to escape with the children anymore. They were planning to kill everyone who could identify them, including 7 innocent kids whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Marcus felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd had when he'd found his squad pinned down by German fire, watching his friends die one by one, while enemy reinforcements closed in from 3 sides. The feeling that had turned Matthew Stone from a small-town farm boy into the most decorated soldier in his division. The feeling that had earned him the nickname Ghost after he'd single-handedly eliminated an entire German machine gun nest using nothing but a combat knife and 78 years of pure, concentrated fury. Marcus Stone checked his watch. 12:14 a.m. The monitoring company would be dispatching a technician to check the cameras in 6 minutes. Local police would arrive shortly after that, walking into a massacre, unless the ghost of Normandy reminded these modern soldiers what real warfare looked like. Marcus began to move through Kiddie Kingdom like his call sign suggested, a phantom that appeared and disappeared without warning. He used every trick he'd learned in occupied France, the art of moving between heartbeats, the discipline of breathing so quietly that even trained ears couldn't detect him, the ability to become part of the shadows until even his own reflection forgot he was there. The first target was Torres, who'd positioned himself near the Lego display with a clear sightline to the castle playhouse. Marcus approached from behind, using the tall shelving units as cover. Torres was good. He checked his 6 every 30 seconds, swept his corners professionally, maintained proper spacing from his teammates. But Torres had never been hunted by someone who'd learned infiltration from the French resistance. Marcus waited until Torres was focused on a sound near the front of the store, Richardson knocking over a display while searching the dress-up area. In that moment of divided attention, Marcus moved. The utility knife went in, just below Torres's ear, angled upward, a technique he'd learned from a resistance fighter named Marie, who'd killed 17 Nazi officers before the Gestapo finally caught her. Quick, silent, and absolutely final. Torres dropped without a sound, his weapon clattering softly to the floor. Marcus caught the rifle before it could make noise, checked the chamber, and smiled with grim satisfaction. Military-grade automatic weapon, full magazine, with 2 spares taped to the stock. Professional equipment for professional work. He'd gone from being hunted to being the hunter in less than 30 seconds. "Torres, report!" Alpha's voice crackled through the dead man's radio. Marcus keyed the mic and spoke in a perfect imitation of Torres's voice, a skill he'd learned from copying Nazi radio operators during reconnaissance missions. "All clear. Sector 3 secure." "Copy that." "Richardson, status?" "Still searching. This old bastard is slippery." Alpha was silent for a moment, and Marcus could almost hear him thinking. The man was smart, experienced, and starting to realize that his intelligence about Marcus Stone had been catastrophically wrong. "Rodriguez," Alpha said finally, "tell me again about this security guard. Everything you know." Dylan's voice was shaking now. I told you, he's just an old man. Talk slow, move slow. Everybody makes fun of him. He's been here forever, just does his job, never causes trouble. I swear, that's all I know." "Age? 70-something, maybe 75? Military background?" I don't know. Never asked. Nobody talks to him much." Marcus could hear Alpha processing this information, probably running calculations in his head. A man in his 70s would have been born in the late 1940s, could have served in Vietnam, maybe Korea if he'd lied about his age. But Alpha was thinking conventional military service. He wasn't thinking about a 20-year-old paratrooper who dropped into Nazi-occupied France on D-Day and spent 3 years learning to kill people with whatever came to hand. Marcus began his approach on Richardson, who was systematically searching the art supplies section. Richardson was more cautious than Torres, more experienced, but he was thinking like a hunter tracking prey. He wasn't thinking like prey being hunted by an apex predator. Marcus used the children's play tunnel system to move undetected, crawling through the colorful plastic tubes that connected different sections of the store. It was undignified for a 75-year-old man, but dignity was a luxury he'd sacrificed long ago on the beaches of Normandy. Richardson was crouched behind a display of children's easels, scanning the store through his rifle scope. Professional stance, proper breathing, excellent field of fire. He'd probably been a sniper in whatever military unit he'd served with. Marcus had killed snipers before. The trick was patience. He waited in the tunnel, watching Richardson through the plastic window, studying his patterns. Every 45 seconds, Richardson would shift position slightly to maintain circulation in his legs. Every 2 minutes, he'd check his 6. Every 3 minutes, he'd key his radio to maintain contact with Alpha. Marcus timed his move for the 30-second mark in Richardson's cycle, when the sniper was most focused on his scope and least aware of his surroundings. The plastic tunnel exit was directly behind Richardson's position. Marcus emerged silently, the utility knife in his left hand, Torres's rifle in his right. Richardson sensed movement at the last second and started to turn, but 78 years of muscle memory kicked in. The knife took Richardson in the kidney, angled upward toward the heart. Marcus caught the man's rifle as he fell, preventing any noise that might alert Alpha. 2 down, 1 professional and 1 amateur remaining, but as Marcus dragged Richardson's body behind a display of tricycles, he heard something that made his blood run cold. "Daddy? Daddy, where are you?" One of the children, the little girl with pigtails, had broken free from her zip ties and was crying for her father. Marcus could see her from his position, wandering around the play area in terror, completely exposed. Alpha appeared from behind a shelf display, his rifle trained on the child. "Richardson, Torres, converge on the play area. We're changing tactics." Marcus realized with sick certainty what Alpha was planning. He was going to use the children as bait, force Marcus to expose himself by threatening innocent lives. It was a smart, tactical decision. It was also a fatal mistake, because Alpha had just threatened the one thing that could transform Marcus Stone from a careful, methodical hunter into the ghost of Normandy. The same berserker who'd charged across 50 yards of open ground under machine gun fire to save 7 wounded soldiers. "Rodriguez," Alpha called out, his voice echoing through the store. "I know you're listening, old man. I don't know who you really are, but I know you care about these kids. So here's how this works." Alpha grabbed the little girl, pressing his sidearm to her head. She whimpered but didn't struggle, too frightened to move. "You have 30 seconds to surrender, or I start executing children, 1 every 30 seconds until you give yourself up." Marcus felt the familiar transformation beginning, the same change that had come over him in that crater outside Sainte-Mère-Église when he'd watched his squad leader die from a sniper's bullet. The careful, methodical part of his mind stepped aside, making room for something older and infinitely more dangerous, the thing that had earned him the Medal of Honor, the thing that had given him nightmares for 78 years. The thing that had made Nazi veterans wake up screaming about the American ghost who appeared in their trenches like death itself. Marcus Stone stood up from behind the tricycle display, Torres's rifle in his hands, and spoke in a voice that carried across the store like a death sentence. "You want to know who I am, son? I'm the man who killed 47 Nazis in a single night at Sainte-Mère-Église. I'm the soldier who walked through a minefield to save 7 dying men while German mortars turned the ground around me into hell on earth. Alpha's eyes widened as he recognized something in Marcus's voice, something that transcended age and infirmity. I'm Sergeant Matthew Stone, 101st Airborne Division, and I didn't survive Normandy just to watch some piece of trash hurt children in a toy store. Marcus began walking toward Alpha, the rifle steady in his hands. His movement no longer the shuffling gait of an elderly security guard, but the confident stride of a combat veteran. So here's my counteroffer, you son of a bitch. Let the girl go, and I'll give you a 5-second head start before I show you what I learned about killing people in Nazi Germany. Alpha's hand was shaking now, the gun trembling against the child's temple. You're bluffing. You won't risk the girl's life. Marcus smiled, and it was the same smile that had terrified SS officers in the ruins of Carentan. Son, I've been dead for 78 years. What exactly do you think I have to lose? Alpha made his choice. He pulled the trigger, but the little girl was no longer there. Because Marcus Stone had just reminded everyone in Kiddie Kingdom why the 101st Airborne Division called him the fastest man in Europe. And Dylan Rodriguez, watching from behind the checkout counter, was finally beginning to understand why you should never, ever mock a man's slow speech, especially when that man had once saved 7 lives under fire and earned his scars fighting the most evil regime in human history. The ghost of Normandy was back, and God help anyone who stood between him and those children. Time moved differently for Marcus Stone in moments of absolute crisis. It was a phenomenon he'd first experienced on Omaha Beach when a Nazi mortar shell had exploded 6 feet from his foxhole. In the space between the flash and the concussion, he'd had enough time to count the pieces of shrapnel spinning toward his head, calculate trajectories, and decide which way to roll to minimize the damage. 78 years later, watching Alpha's finger tighten on the trigger, Marcus felt that same temporal distortion kick in. He had perhaps 1/10 of a second before the bullet left the chamber. The little girl, Emma, he'd heard Alpha call her, was 12 feet away. Alpha was positioned behind a display of stuffed bears, using them as partial cover while keeping the gun pressed to Emma's temple. Physics and human reflexes said it was impossible. Marcus Stone had built a career on proving physics wrong. He dropped Torres's rifle and lunged forward, not toward Alpha, but toward a display of rubber balls that he'd noticed during his earlier reconnaissance. His hand closed around a red playground ball as his body hit the ground in a controlled roll. In one fluid motion, perfected through countless hours of grenade training in Georgia mud, he hurled the ball with the same precision that had once allowed him to drop Nazi potato mashers back into German trenches. The ball struck Alpha's gun hand just as he pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, punching through a display of cartoon character posters instead of through a 6-year-old skull. Alpha cursed and tried to readjust his aim, but Marcus was already moving again, using the momentum from his roll to spring back to his feet with an agility that belonged to a man 50 years younger. The broken ribs he'd carried since Normandy screamed in protest, but pain was just another enemy to be ignored. Emma, freed from Alpha's grip when the ball struck his hand, ran toward the other children who were huddled together near the train table. Smart girl. She'd instinctively moved away from the threat instead of freezing. Alpha raised his weapon again, but Marcus had closed half the distance between them. The mercenary leader fired 3 quick shots, but Marcus was moving in an evasive pattern he'd learned from dodging sniper fire in Carentan. Never straight lines, never predictable rhythm, always using available cover. A bullet clipped the shoulder of his security uniform, spinning him slightly, but didn't slow him down. Another shattered a toy robot inches from his head, showering him with plastic fragments. The third shot never came. Because Marcus Stone had just reminded Alpha why the 101st Airborne had called him the fastest man in Europe. The utility knife took Alpha in the wrist, severing tendons and forcing him to drop his sidearm. Marcus followed up with a chokehold that would have made his old drill instructor proud. Not enough pressure to kill, but enough to render Alpha unconscious in approximately 15 seconds. Alpha was good, though. He drove his elbow back into Marcus's ribs and broke free from the hold, spinning around with a combat knife of his own. The blade whistled past Marcus's throat, missing by millimeters. They circled each other among the stuffed animals and toy displays, two old soldiers fighting a war that had started decades before either of them was born. Alpha was younger, stronger, and hadn't spent 78 years carrying shrapnel in his skull. But Marcus was fighting for 7 children instead of a paycheck. That made all the difference. Alpha lunged with his knife, a professional thrust aimed at Marcus's heart. Marcus deflected with his left forearm, accepting a shallow cut to avoid a fatal wound, and responded with a knee strike that would have ended the fight if Alpha hadn't twisted away at the last second. They crashed into a display of board games, scattering Monopoly money and Scrabble tiles across the floor. Alpha recovered first and slashed at Marcus's face, but Marcus caught his wrist and twisted, applying pressure to the nerve cluster that would force him to drop the weapon. Alpha headbutted Marcus instead, breaking his nose and sending blood streaming down his face. Marcus staggered back, momentarily blinded, and Alpha pressed his advantage with a series of quick strikes aimed at nerve points and pressure points. For a moment, Marcus felt his age, felt the weight of nearly 8 decades of accumulated damage, the slow reaction times that came with a traumatic brain injury, the simple reality that he was fighting a man 40 years younger who'd probably learned hand-to-hand combat from the same military manuals that Marcus had helped write. Then he heard Emma crying, and everything else stopped mattering. Marcus Stone had spent 78 years trying to forget the sound of dying men calling for their mothers on a beach in France. He'd carried their voices with him through 7 decades of quiet nights and peaceful dreams, a reminder of the price of his survival. He would not add a child's voice to that collection. Marcus feinted left, drawing Alpha's attention, then pivoted right and drove his elbow into the man's solar plexus. Alpha doubled over, gasping, and Marcus followed up with an uppercut that lifted the mercenary leader off his feet and sent him crashing into a display of toy trucks. Alpha tried to rise, blood streaming from his mouth, but Marcus was already there. The utility knife went in just below Alpha's collarbone, angled downward to avoid vital organs, not a killing blow, but enough to end the fight. Alpha collapsed, clutching his shoulder, his eyes wide with shock and grudging respect. Who the hell are you?" he gasped. Marcus stood over him, breathing hard, his security uniform torn and bloody. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every battle he'd ever fought, every life he'd ever taken, every night he'd ever woken up screaming. "I'm the man you should have asked about before you decided to hurt children in my mall." Dylan Rodriguez emerged from behind the checkout counter, his face pale with terror and understanding. He looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw past the gray hair and slow speech to the steel underneath. "Jesus Christ," Dylan whispered. "You really did it. Those guys were professionals, and you helped me secure them," Marcus said quietly, pulling zip ties from his belt. "Police will be here soon." As they worked to restrain Alpha, Marcus heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The monitoring company had finally dispatched units to check on the camera outage, and someone had called in reports of gunshots. "Marcus," Dylan said hesitantly as they zip-tied Alpha's hands behind his back. "I'm sorry. About the videos, about making fun of you, about everything. I had no idea." Marcus looked at the young man for a long moment. Dylan was just a kid, really, barely older than Marcus had been when he jumped out of a C-47 into Nazi-occupied France. A kid who'd made stupid choices and nearly gotten 7 children killed, but who was also clearly horrified by what he'd helped unleash. "You gave them information about my patrol routes," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. Dylan nodded miserably. "They said it was just a robbery. They said nobody would get hurt, that they just needed to know when you wouldn't be around certain areas. I needed the money, my mum's medical bills." He trailed off, realizing how pathetic the excuse sounded. They were trafficking children, Dylan. 7 kids who would have disappeared forever if you hadn't called attention to yourself by filming me. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Dylan's mockery, meant to humiliate Marcus, had actually alerted him to the danger and given him time to respond. "What's going to happen to me?" Dylan asked. Marcus considered the question. The young man had made terrible choices, but he'd also been manipulated by professionals who specialized in exploiting desperation, and he'd shown genuine remorse when confronted with the consequences of his actions. "That depends on what you do next," Marcus said finally. "The FBI is going to want to know everything about how they recruited you, who else might be involved, how many other operations like this they're running." Dylan nodded rapidly. "I'll tell them everything, I swear. I'll cooperate completely." Marcus heard footsteps in the mall corridor. Police, probably, or FBI tactical teams. The cavalry had finally arrived, but the battle was already over. "Marcus!" Emma's small voice cut through the approaching chaos. She was standing near the train table with the other 6 children, all of them looking at him with a mixture of fear and awe. "Yes, sweetheart? Are you really a soldier?" Marcus knelt down so he was at her eye level, wincing as his broken ribs protested the movement. He looked at 7 young faces, seeing in them the same terror and confusion he'd seen in the eyes of civilians during the war. "I was," he said gently, "a long time ago." "Did you really save 7 soldiers?" Marcus felt something break open in his chest, something he'd kept carefully locked away for 78 years. These children were alive because he'd remembered how to be Matthew Stone instead of Marcus Stone. They were safe because he'd found his way back to the man he'd been before Nazi shrapnel had stolen his easy words and quick movements. "Yes," he said quietly, "I did." Emma stepped forward and hugged him, her small arms barely reaching around his waist. The other children followed, and suddenly Marcus was surrounded by 7 kids who saw him not as a slow-talking security guard, but as the hero he'd tried so hard to forget he'd ever been. Outside, Marcus could hear tactical teams setting up perimeter positions, FBI agents coordinating with local police, paramedics preparing to treat casualties. The professionals were taking over, just like they always did. But for just a moment, in a toy store filled with broken displays and scattered evidence of violence, Marcus Stone allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt since 1944, pride in a job well done, 7 children safe, 7 lives preserved, just like that day on the beach when he'd carried wounded soldiers through a minefield while Nazi artillery turned the sky orange with fire. Some numbers never changed. Sir, we need to get you medical attention." Marcus looked up to see a young FBI agent, couldn't be more than 25, with earnest eyes and a tactical vest that looked like it had never been tested in actual combat. "I'm fine," Marcus said, gently extricating himself from the children's embrace. "Sir, you're bleeding from multiple wounds, and we have reports that you engaged armed suspects single-handedly. We need to debrief you and get you to a hospital." Marcus almost smiled. The young agent was trying to be professional, but Marcus could see the confusion in his eyes. How does a 75-year-old security guard take down 3 armed mercenaries? How does someone who talks like he has cognitive issues demonstrate tactical awareness that most special forces operators would envy? "Agent Morrison, sir. Agent David Morrison." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Morrison, the same name as his old squad leader, Technical Sergeant William Morrison, who taught him how to kill silently and move like smoke through enemy territory. "Any relation to William Morrison?" Marcus asked quietly. Agent Morrison's eyes widened. That was my grandfather. How did you—" Marcus studied the young man's face and saw familiar features. The same strong jaw, the same intelligent eyes, the same bearing that had made Wild Bill Morrison one of the most respected NCOs in the 101st Airborne. "Your grandfather saved my life in Normandy," Marcus said, "multiple times. "Sir, my grandfather died when I was 12. He never talked about the war much, but he mentioned a soldier named Stone, Matthew Stone, said he was the bravest man he'd ever known." Marcus felt the weight of decades pressing down on him. Wild Bill's grandson, grown up and carrying a badge, looking at him with the same mixture of respect and curiosity that had been in his grandfather's eyes all those years ago. "Your grandfather was a good man," Marcus said finally. "He deserved better than what happened to him." "What did happen to him, sir? He never told us the details." Marcus looked around the toy store, at the evidence of the night's violence, at the 7 children who were now safe because he'd remembered how to be a soldier. Some stories needed to be told, he realized. Some truths were too important to die with the men who'd lived them. "Agent Morrison," he said quietly, "when we're done here, I think it's time someone told you about your grandfather's war." The FBI agent nodded, understanding that he was about to learn something important about his family's history. But as EMTs arrived to treat Marcus's wounds and crime scene technicians began processing evidence, Marcus was thinking about something else entirely. Alpha had been taking orders from someone. The operation was too sophisticated, too well-funded to be a standalone event. There were other teams, other targets, other children at risk. And somewhere out there, the person responsible for tonight's horror was probably already planning their next move. Marcus Stone had spent 12 years trying to be invisible, trying to be forgotten, trying to live a quiet life where his past couldn't hurt anyone else. But some ghosts, once awakened, don't go quietly back to sleep. As the FBI led him away for debriefing, Marcus was already planning his next move in a war that had started 78 years ago and was apparently far from over. Because 7 children were safe tonight, but somewhere else 7 other children might not be so lucky, and Marcus Stone had promises to keep to men who died, believing their sacrifice meant something. The ghost of Normandy was back in business, and this time he wasn't planning to retire. The FBI safe house in Quantico was nothing like the field hospitals Marcus remembered from Normandy, but the antiseptic smell and hushed conversations brought back memories anyway. He sat in a conference room that had seen countless debriefings, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, listening to Agent Morrison explain why everything they'd thought they knew about the Kiddie Kingdom incident was wrong. "The trafficking operation was bigger than we imagined," Morrison said, spreading photographs across the table. "Alpha's real name was Viktor Kozlov, former Spetsnaz, dishonorably discharged in 2018. But he wasn't the architect, he was middle management." Marcus studied the photos, surveillance images of well-dressed men in expensive suits, shipping manifests with coded destinations, floor plans of buildings across 3 states. The scope of it made his stomach turn. "How many children?" he asked quietly. "We've identified at least 47 missing persons cases that match their operational pattern over the past 2 years. 7 to 12-year-olds, mostly from single-parent homes or foster care, taken from locations where they had inside information about security protocols." Marcus felt that familiar cold settling in his chest. 47 children. 7 times 7 minus 2. The mathematics of tragedy calculated with military precision. And Dylan was just one of many inside sources. Morrison nodded grimly. They had people in 12 different locations. Mall security guards, school janitors, daycare workers, anyone with access and financial desperation. Dylan's cooperation led us to most of them. Marcus had visited Dylan twice since the incident. The young man was in protective custody, helping the FBI map the entire network in exchange for a reduced sentence. The cocky kid who'd made fun of Marcus's slow speech had been replaced by someone who looked 10 years older and carried the weight of his mistakes in every gesture. "The good news," Morrison continued, "is that we've rescued 23 children so far. The bad news is that Victor gave us enough information before he died to know this was just one tentacle of something much larger." Marcus looked up sharply. "Died? Suicide?" Somehow got hold of a cyanide capsule in federal custody. Very professional, very final. But not before he told us about something called Operation Ghostlight. The name sent a chill down Marcus's spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. What's Operation Ghostlight? Morrison hesitated, then slid a manila folder across the table. That's where it gets personal, Mr. Stone. Or should I say, Sergeant Stone. Marcus opened the folder and felt 78 years of carefully buried memories come flooding back. Inside were photocopies of military records, classified documents from World War II, and a list of names he hadn't seen in decades. His old squad, all 7 men he'd saved at Sainte-Mère-Église, all 7 men who were now dead. They weren't just trafficking children randomly, Morrison said quietly. They were targeting the descendants of specific World War II veterans. Your 7 squad members had a combined total of 19 grandchildren and great-grandchildren in the target age range. Marcus's hands began to shake, not from age, but from rage so pure it threatened to consume him. How many? 14 so far. 5 are still missing. Marcus closed his eyes and saw their faces. Tommy Richards, who'd taken Nazi shrapnel in both legs but kept firing until Marcus could reach him. Billy Morrison, Agent Morrison's grandfather, who'd held off an entire German squad with a broken rifle and pure, stubborn courage. Danny O'Brien, who'd been 19 years old and terrified, but had followed Marcus across a minefield because he trusted him to bring them all home. They died of old age, thinking their families were safe, thinking the war was over. They'd been wrong. Who's behind it? Marcus asked, his voice deadly quiet. Morrison pulled out another photograph. An elderly man in an expensive suit, standing beside a black Mercedes in what looked like Switzerland. The man had pale eyes, silver hair, and the bearing of someone accustomed to wealth and power. Heinrich Sommer, Morrison said. 94 years old, Swiss citizen, officially retired from international banking. Unofficially, he's the son of SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Sommer, who was killed during the liberation of a concentration camp in 1945. Marcus stared at the photograph and felt time collapse. He remembered Klaus Sommer, a Nazi officer who'd been particularly brutal even by SS standards, responsible for the torture and execution of captured Allied soldiers. Marcus had been part of the unit that had cornered him in a bunker outside Berlin. Sommer had been shot while trying to escape, but not before he'd sworn that his family would have revenge on the Americans who destroyed the Reich. 78 years later, his son was making good on that promise. The children aren't being sold, Morrison continued. They're being used as bait. Sommer's been drawing out the descendants of Allied veterans, using their missing children to lure families into vulnerable positions. Then he eliminates entire bloodlines. Genocide, Marcus said flatly. Exactly, but targeted, personal genocide. He's been systematically hunting down the families of every soldier who contributed to Nazi defeats. Your squad was just one target among hundreds. Marcus thought about Emma, the little girl with pigtails who'd hugged him in the toy store. About her parents, probably frantic with worry for 3 weeks while the FBI tried to untangle Sommer's web. About the other children still out there, being used as pawns in a war that should have ended in 1945. Where is he? Morrison hesitated. We have intelligence suggesting he's operating from a compound in the Swiss Alps. But Mr. Stone, we can't just... Where in the Swiss Alps? Sir, with all due respect, you're 75 years old. You've done enough. Let us handle this through official channels. Marcus stood up slowly, feeling every one of his 75 years in his joints and muscles. But he also felt something else, something that had been dormant for decades but was now fully awake. Purpose. Agent Morrison, how many children did your grandfather save during the war? I don't know the exact number. Why? 47, Marcus said quietly. Billy Morrison saved 47 American soldiers during his 3 years of combat. I know because I was there for most of it. He died thinking that meant something, thinking he'd made the world safer for his family. Marcus walked to the window and looked out at the Virginia countryside, green and peaceful under an autumn sky that looked nothing like the smoke-filled hellscape of wartime Europe. Heinrich Sommer has 47 children in his custody, Agent Morrison. The same number of lives your grandfather saved. You think that's a coincidence? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that some wars never end. They just go underground and wait for the next generation to pick up the fight. Marcus turned back to face the young agent. And I'm suggesting that maybe it's time the ghost of Normandy reminded the world what happens to people who hurt children. 2 days later, Millbrook Mall. Marcus walked through the mall's main corridor at 11:47 p.m., just like he had for 12 years. But everything was different now. The maintenance staff, who used to ignore him, nodded respectfully when he passed. The few late-night shoppers recognized him from the news coverage and whispered among themselves about the hero security guard who'd saved 7 children. But Marcus wasn't thinking about recognition or respect. He was thinking about intelligence reports, surveillance photographs, and a heavily fortified compound in the Swiss mountains where 5 children were being held by a 94-year-old Nazi who thought he could finish what his father had started. The official channels were moving too slowly. International law, diplomatic protocols, jurisdictional complications, all the bureaucratic machinery that allowed evil men to operate with impunity while children suffered. Marcus had fought bureaucracy before. During the war, when Allied command had wanted to write off captured soldiers as acceptable losses, when military lawyers had argued that certain rescue missions violated the Geneva Convention, when politicians had decided that some battles weren't worth fighting. He'd learned a long time ago that sometimes you had to ignore the rules to do what was right. His phone buzzed with a text message from a number he didn't recognize. Package ready for pickup. Loading dock 3. Come alone? Marcus smiled grimly. Agent Morrison might work for the FBI, but he was Billy Morrison's grandson, and Billy Morrison had never been one to let bureaucracy get in the way of saving lives. Loading dock 3 was behind the old Sears, in a section of the mall that had been abandoned since the department store closed 2 years earlier. Marcus found Morrison waiting beside an unmarked van, along with a woman Marcus didn't recognize. "Mr. Stone," Morrison said, "I'd like you to meet Dr. Sarah Chen. She's a linguist and cultural specialist who's been tracking Summer's organization for the past 5 years." Dr. Chen stepped forward, and Marcus saw something familiar in her eyes. The same combination of determination and barely controlled fury that he'd seen in resistance fighters during the war. "My grandfather was Lieutenant James Chen, Army Air Corps," she said without preamble. "Shot down over Germany in 1943. Spent 2 years in a POW camp run by Klaus Sommer. 3 of my cousins have disappeared in the past year." Marcus nodded, understanding. Another bloodline being hunted, another family being systematically destroyed by ghosts from the past. "What's the plan?" he asked. Morrison opened the van's rear doors, revealing equipment that definitely hadn't been checked out through official FBI channels. Night vision gear, climbing equipment, communication devices, and weapons that looked like they'd been borrowed from a special operations unit. "Officially, there is no plan," Morrison said. "The Bureau is pursuing diplomatic solutions through appropriate international channels. Dr. Chen is taking a leave of absence to visit family in Switzerland. And you're recovering from injuries sustained in the line of duty." "Unofficially?" Dr. Chen smiled, and it reminded Marcus of Marie, the French resistance fighter who taught him how to kill silently. "Unofficially, we're going to remind Heinrich Sommer that some debts can only be paid in blood." Marcus looked at the equipment, at the 2 people who were willing to throw away their careers to save children they'd never met, and felt something he hadn't felt since 1944, like he was part of a team again. "When do we leave?" "Wheels up in 6 hours, Morrison said. Private jet, civilian identities, insertion via Switzerland's eastern border. And the children. Intelligence suggests they're being held in Summer's private compound near Zermatt. Heavily fortified private security, but nothing we can't handle if we're smart about it. Marcus thought about Emma, about the way she'd hugged him in the toy store, about the trust in her eyes when she'd asked if he was really a soldier. He thought about the other children still out there, being used as pawns in an old man's quest for revenge. He thought about 7 young men who died, believing their sacrifice had made the world safer for future generations. "Count me in," he said. 36 hours later, Swiss Alps. The compound looked like something out of a James Bond movie. Ultra-modern architecture carved into the mountainside, with panoramic windows that reflected the snow-covered peaks and defensive positions that would make a military engineer weep with envy. Marcus observed it through high-powered binoculars from a ridge 3 kilometers away, mentally cataloguing guard positions, patrol patterns, and potential entry points. 18 visible guards, he reported quietly into his throat mic. Professional spacing, military-grade weapons, thermal imaging systems on the perimeter. This isn't a residence, it's a fortress. Dr. Chen's voice crackled back through his earpiece. Satellite thermal shows approximately 30 people inside the main building. 5 heat signatures are smaller and stationary, probably our children. Guard rotation every 4 hours, Morrison added from his position on the compound's northern approach. But there's a 10-minute gap during shift change when the eastern approach is only covered by automated systems. Marcus studied the compound's layout, comparing it to defensive positions he'd encountered during the war. Summer's security team was professional, but they were thinking like bodyguards protecting a VIP, not soldiers defending against a military assault. That was their weakness. "Chen, can you disable their communications array from your position? Give me 15 minutes and a clear line of sight." "Morrison, what's your assessment of the main gate?" "Hardened, but nothing a little C4 can't solve. Problem is, it'll announce our arrival to everyone within 5 kilometers. Marcus lowered his binoculars and smiled. These young people were thinking like law enforcement officers, trying to solve the problem through superior firepower and technology. But Marcus Stone had learned warfare from men who'd fought when technology meant hoping your rifle didn't jam and firepower meant making every bullet count. "New plan," he said quietly. "We don't go through the defenses. We go around them." "Sir?" "Summer is 94 years old, which means he lived through World War II. He's been planning this revenge for 78 years, which means he's paranoid and methodical. But he's also arrogant enough to believe that his money and security can protect him from the past." Marcus pointed to a section of the mountainside that looked completely inaccessible. Sheer rock face covered in ice, with no apparent handholds or approach routes. "He's not expecting ghosts." 2 hours before dawn, Marcus Stone hung suspended on a rope 300 feet above certain death, moving up the face of an alpine cliff in complete darkness, and felt more alive than he had in decades. The mountain wind cut through his thermal gear like knives. His hands were numb despite the specialized gloves, and every muscle in his 75-year-old body screamed in protest. But his mind was crystal clear, focused on the rhythm of the climb. Test the hold, shift weight, find the next grip, breathe. The same methodical precision that had carried him through Nazi minefields and burning buildings. Below him, Morrison and Dr. Chen followed his route, their younger bodies struggling with a climb that Marcus made look effortless. They were good, better than good, but they'd learned mountaineering from instructors in safe environments. Marcus had learned it from necessity, when falling meant capture, torture, and death. How the hell is he doing this? Morrison's voice was strained through the radio. "Shut up and climb," Dr. Chen replied, but Marcus could hear the amazement in her voice too. Marcus reached the compound's perimeter and carefully cut through the sensor array that was supposed to detect intruders. The system was state-of-the-art, but it was designed to catch people coming up the normal approach routes, not climbing down from above like some geriatric spider. He dropped silently onto the compound's roof and immediately began moving toward the main building's ventilation system. The blueprints Dr. Chen had obtained showed a service corridor that ran directly past the room where the thermal imaging had detected the children. As Marcus worked his way through the ventilation shaft, he heard voices below, guards discussing shift rotations in German, kitchen staff preparing breakfast, and one voice that made his blood run cold. Heinrich Sommer, speaking in accented English to someone Marcus couldn't see. "The American children have served their purpose," Sommer was saying. "Their families have been located and will be eliminated within the week. After that, we move to the next phase. And the children? Dispose of them. We have no further use for them." Marcus felt the same transformation that had come over him in the toy store, the same cold fury that had made him a legend among paratroopers. These weren't soldiers or combatants. These were children being casually ordered to execution by a man who thought his money made him untouchable. Heinrich Sommer was about to learn that some ghosts couldn't be bought. Marcus dropped through a ceiling vent into the corridor outside the room where the children were being held. Two guards stood outside the door, armed with automatic weapons, speaking quietly in German about how much they were being paid to babysit. Marcus had killed guards before. SS sentries outside prison camps, Wehrmacht soldiers protecting weapons depots, Gestapo agents who thought their badges made them safe from retribution. These guards lasted exactly as long as their predecessors. Marcus opened the door and found 5 children huddled together on a single bed, 3 girls and 2 boys, ages 7 to 11, all wearing the hollow expression of kids who'd been scared for too long. "It's okay," Marcus said quietly, pulling out his FBI identification. "I'm here to take you home." The oldest child, a boy with brown hair and intelligent eyes, looked at Marcus with desperate hope. "Are you really FBI?" "I'm really FBI," Marcus confirmed. "And I'm really going to get you out of here." But as he helped the children toward the window, where Morrison was waiting with repelling equipment, Marcus heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Multiple sets, moving with military precision. Sommer's guards had discovered their dead colleagues. "Change of plans," Marcus said into his throat mic. "We're compromised. Chen, create a distraction. Morrison, get ready to move fast." Explosions erupted from the communications building as Dr. Chen destroyed everything electronic she could find. Alarms began blaring throughout the compound, and Marcus could hear orders being shouted in German as guards rushed to respond to multiple threats. But 5 children couldn't rappel down a mountainside in the dark, and Marcus wasn't leaving anyone behind. Not again, not after 78 years of carrying survivors' guilt like shrapnel in his chest. "Morrison," he said quietly into his radio, "get the children to safety. Chen, extract to the rendezvous point." "What about you?" Marcus thought about 7 young soldiers in a crater outside Sainte-Mère-Église, about 47 children who'd been stolen from their families, about a 94-year-old Nazi who thought he could finish what his father had started. "I've got unfinished business." Marcus Stone walked through the corridors of Heinrich Sommer's fortress like the ghost he'd always been, but this time he wasn't hiding in shadows or moving silently through enemy territory. This time, he wanted to be seen. He found Sommer in his study, surrounded by Nazi memorabilia and photographs of the Third Reich, calmly burning documents in a marble fireplace as if he had all the time in the world. "Herr Sommer," Marcus said quietly from the doorway. The old Nazi turned, and Marcus saw eyes that held the same cold arrogance he'd seen in every SS officer he'd ever killed. Age had withered Sommer's body, but it hadn't touched the evil in his soul. "So," Sommer said in perfect English, "the famous ghost of Normandy comes to visit. I wondered when you would find me." "Your father died screaming," Marcus said conversationally. "Did you know that? When we cornered him in that bunker, he begged for mercy, cried for his mother. It was pathetic." Sommer's face flushed with rage. "My father was a hero of the Reich. He died fighting Jewish mongrels and American dogs." Your father was a coward who tortured prisoners and murdered children, just like you. Marcus stepped into the room, noting the panic button on Sommer's desk, the hidden gun drawer, the security camera that was probably broadcasting to guards who were already dead or fleeing. You know, Marcus continued, I've spent 78 years feeling guilty about surviving when better men died, wondering if I deserved to live when heroes like Billy Morrison and Danny O'Brien didn't make it home. But looking at you, I finally understand why I survived. And why is that, American? Marcus smiled, and it was the same smile that had terrified Nazi officers from Normandy to Berlin. So I could finish what we started. Heinrich Sommer reached for his panic button, but Marcus Stone had been killing Nazis since before Sommer was born. The son of the SS Oberfuhrer died exactly like his father had, badly and alone, and with the knowledge that everything he'd believed in was dust. But unlike his father, Heinrich Sommer died knowing that the ghost of Normandy had kept his promise to 7 dead soldiers and 47 stolen children. Some debts, Marcus reflected as Swiss police sirens wailed in the distance, could only be paid in blood. 6 months later, Millbrook Mall Emma Rodriguez, Dylan's little sister, whose disappearance had been the final piece that led them to Sommer's network, stood in front of the toy store that had been rebuilt after the incident, holding her brother's hand and looking up at the bronze plaque that had been installed beside the entrance. In memory of the children who were lost, and in honor of those who brought them home, she read slowly. Does that mean you, Mr. Marcus? Marcus Stone, wearing a new security uniform with Chief of Security embroidered on the pocket, knelt down to her level and smiled. His speech was still slow, still careful, but the words came easier now. It means all of us, sweetheart. Everyone who helped bring you and the other children home safe. Dylan, who'd completed his community service and started college classes in criminal justice, squeezed his sister's hand. Emma, remember what we talked about. Mr. Marcus doesn't like being called a hero. But he is one, Emma insisted with the absolute certainty that only children possess. He saved us. He saved everybody. Marcus looked around the mall that had become his second home. Agent Morrison, now Director Morrison, following a very quiet but very impressive promotion, stopped by every few weeks to brief him on cases where his particular expertise might be useful. Dr. Chen had returned to her university position, but still sent Christmas cards from wherever in the world she was researching linguistic patterns. The night shift workers who used to ignore him now competed to sit with him during breaks, eager to hear stories about the old days. He never told them about the war. Some stories were too heavy for casual conversation, but he talked about simpler times, when mall security meant helping lost children find their parents, and the biggest threat was teenagers shoplifting candy. But sometimes, late at night when the mall was empty and quiet, Marcus would walk his rounds and remember what it felt like to have a purpose beyond just existing, to be part of something larger than himself, to matter. Mr. Marcus? Emma's voice brought him back to the present. My mom wants to know if you'll come to my birthday party next week. I'm turning 7. 7. Always 7. I'd be honored, Marcus said, meaning it completely. As the Rodriguez family walked away, chatting about party plans and birthday presents, Marcus continued his evening rounds. The mall was peaceful, filled with the ordinary sounds of a place where families came to spend time together, where children played and laughed and grew up safe. It was exactly the kind of world that 7 young soldiers had died protecting on a beach in Normandy 78 years ago. Marcus Stone had spent most of his life trying to forget he was a hero. Now finally, he was ready to remember that some people are worth saving, some fights are worth fighting, and some ghosts are meant to protect the living. The ghost of Normandy was officially retired from war, but Marcus Stone, protector of children and guardian of peaceful nights, was just getting started, and if anyone thought that made him less dangerous, well, they clearly hadn't been paying attention to what happened to the last group of people who underestimated a slow-talking old man in a security uniform. Marcus smiled as he walked past the toy store, noting that the new night vision cameras had excellent coverage of every blind spot, and that the upgraded communication system would alert backup within 30 seconds of any emergency. Some habits, after all, die hard, especially the good ones.